So in physics, there are some what we call basic physical quantities. Like if you've ever played with Lego, you can build a castle out of Lego. But you know, there are only going to be several blocks you use, different kinds of colored blocks that you use to build bigger blocks, and ultimately all of those build you a castle. So you have basic physical quantities. These are your basic Lego blocks. और उनसे हम फिर derived quantities बनाते हैं. These are like your bigger blocks or your castles. And I will just explain with examples. But again, just a visual to help you understand this. Like you could say that this red block here is a basic quantity. And you could say, for example, that this green block is also a basic quantity, this yellow block is also a basic quantity, and together they have made something that is called a derived quantity. Derived का मतलब है कि आपने उसको extract किया, आपने किसी और चीज से उसको बनाया. So now let's understand what some of these basic quantities are. The first one, the most common sense one, is length, right? These are quantities that you cannot create from any other quantity. And I'll give you examples of what that means in a second. Actually, let's just get into that. You know, for example, all of you would probably know that if you have a square and I asked you to find its area, you would say, well, okay, length times length, L times L gives us L squared. And you would be right. Now, area is not a basic quantity. It's a derived quantity because it is made from two Lego blocks of the same color. It's made from length times length, and that gives you centimeter square, meter square. That square also tells you that it's made from two different lengths being multiplied with each other. That's an example of a derived quantity. But here we're talking about basic quantities. So length is the first example. And you know, on the right over here, you can see that there's something called an SI unit. That means Standard International Unit. That is the most common unit that is agreed upon and used in the world. हजार और units होते हैं. मसलन हम foot इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं length के लिए, हम mile इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं length के लिए. There's many units we can use. But when we're talking internationally and we want to be able to understand each other, we tend to use these units. तो उसी तरीके से other basic quantities that cannot be derived from anything else include mass, time, temperature, and electric current. There are also several others. Now, one of the most common mistakes that every single IGCSE and O-level student I have ever taught has made is confusing what is a quantity, what is a unit, and what is a symbol. So let's just get this straight from the outset so that we're crystal clear throughout this entire course. This will help you for life. The first is that there is something called a quantity. A quantity is वो चीज जो आप नापते हैं. So, for example, mass, how heavy something is, right? So that is a quantity. You are measuring the mass of something. अब जब आप लिखते हैं formulas, you know, for example, you write this world famous formula, force is equals to mass into acceleration. The quantity over here is mass in this formula, and you are using m. M is a shortcut, a short way of writing mass. So this is the symbol for this quantity, m. और अब क्या होता है कि जो भी आपके पास यूनिट होता है, आप उसको क्वांटिटी होती है, आप उसको नापते हैं किसी यूनिट में. You can measure mass, for example, in grams. You can measure it in kg. You can measure it in pound. There's many units you can use. So the unit which is used to measure a quantity is, for example, kg. So don't confuse these. अक्सर क्या होता है कि लोग समझते हैं कि kg symbol है. Kg is not the symbol. Kg is the unit. M is the symbol and mass is the quantity. And similarly, for example, if you're talking about length, then length is the quantity. The symbol for it is chota l, usually in physics, and its unit is perhaps centimeters, meters, kilometers, whatever you like. Now, here are some examples of derived quantities. These are quantities that come from the basic Lego blocks, the basic quantities. तो हमने previous example में area की बात की थी कि area comes from length time length. उसी तरीके से volume is another derived quantity because it comes from three of the same kind of Lego block. It comes from length times length times length. For example, if you have a cube, how would you measure its volume? If you remember the formula, it's given by length times length times length, which gives you meter cube. उसी तरीके से बहुत ज़्यादा और derived quantities होती हैं physics में. For example, one you'll become very comfortable with very soon is velocity, which is, for example, measured in meters per second. So that's made of two different kinds of Lego blocks. अगर हम इसकी बात करें, so this is meters per second. This is the first Lego block and this is the second Lego block. और आपने इनको किसी तरीके से तोड़ जोड़ करके एक नई quantity बना ली है called velocity. Now, let's take a moment to pause and appreciate that this is a very, very, very important topic, not only for your final exams, but because historically there is a lot of history behind this. Nations have gone to war over units. Like if you, and I'll just show you this in the next slide, how you can actually study how colonized the world is through the kind of units that we use. Let me kind of give you a clue. Once upon a time, in the ancient world, and well, the not so ancient world, but there used to be these sort of units. For example, the footstep was literally measured by, for example, the size of the current king's foot. Then when you had that king while he was living, they would say, okay, जो इनका पैर की लंबाई है, that is going to be the unit. That is going to be what is 1 foot. And then they would continue doing that throughout the time of the king. Now, compare this with modern instruments, where you have a ruler or you have measuring tape or you have a vernier caliper. इस किस्म के जो modern instruments होते हैं, they can be easily copy pasted and they don't depend on one person who is living in time, something like that. Modern instruments are easy to replicate and often they are based on things that you can easily verify from. For example, if we're talking about 1 kg, right? How did we figure out what 1 kg is? Literally what happened was they took a pathar off the ground and they're like, chalo theek hai, isko 1 kg kehte hain. And then they started making copies of that pathar all across the world so that everyone knew कि exactly ये 1 kg होता है. The original pathar, I think, is preserved inside Paris in France somewhere. And that's literally how they came up with what 1 kg is. But the thing is that the pathar is not a living object. It's not something that you only have access to for a limited amount of time. So it's a very, very helpful way to go about building a quantity. How do you figure out what 1 centimeter is? How do you figure out what 1 meter is? Well, suppose you're the first person to develop what the meter is, and you decide not to use human beings, then what would you do? You would, for example, take, I don't know, perhaps you would just, like trace a line in the ground, and you'd be like, okay, this is 1 meter. But then what you would need to do is make sure that you can always access that line, so that then people across the world, when they, they're building their own rulers, they can make sure that it matches the original length of the original 1 meter. So why did, people in ancient times, for example, go to war? Peculiarly, sometimes it could be over something as bizarre as units, or they were a contributing factor. So for example, I am the current king. My name is Usama. Usama the Great has a nose. And he says that the length of the nose going from hair till hair is going to be what is defined as 1 centimeter. मैं कहता हूँ ये 1 centimeter है. So, this is or I call this unit the Usama. This is what 1 Usama is. Okay, now I die and my grandson comes and kills me in a coup and takes over and he wants my memory to go away completely forever. So what is he going to do? He's not going to like that, his royal robe is going to be measured in Usamas. It's not a nice reminder of, the grandfather who he killed. So what is he going to do? The most common sense thing he's going to do is going to say, okay, no more. We're going to measure using my nose instead. And, we're going to call that the Farooq. I don't know, suppose my grandson is called Farooq. So that is going to be 1 Farooq. अब इसमें मसला क्या होगा कि सारी दुनिया को अपने units फिर से change करने पड़ेंगे. But I kid you not, this is a bit how the ancient world used to work. And that is why we are very grateful today that we have SI units and that, the original copies of them are preserved inside museums that everyone can access, because that really allows us to circumvent this crisis. So, literally, let us see how the world has colonized the world. Well, let's see how Europe has mostly colonized the world through units. These are units that are used everywhere, takriban, sari dunya mein. The fact that I am doing this conversation in English is also an example of colonialism, but I will get to that later in another course. So, for example, Kelvin. Kelvin is a unit for temperature. हम आमतौर पे डिग्री सेल्सियस में बात करते हैं, लेकिन Kelvin is also a unit. तो ये French होता है. There was someone called Lord Kelvin once, and lo and behold, the British conquered most of the known world, and so they decided to name the units that we use today internationally. And so, well, the Kelvin, British. Surprise, surprise. We're also studying a British curriculum. But that's a digression. Uske alawa, for example, we have the meter. Meter is French. Ampere, that is also French. Second, well, this is Greek / Egyptian, but there's a bit of French in there. Then just look at them. Mole, that's German. Kilogram, that's French. And candela, that is European. So in essence, what we're seeing is that the basic building blocks of units within our modern world have all been developed. Their names have come from Europe. So I kid you not when I say that there is also the legacy of colonialism and politics within physics. And so it's really interesting. You know, हम आमतौर पे ये SI unit study करते हैं, हम unit study करते हैं, we just ratify them very quickly in order to get done with our final exam. But if you open up Wikipedia, if you look up Google and you actually look into the history, you'll see that there's a really, really interesting amount of politics and international dynamics at play within these seemingly mundane things within physics.